I'm Deacon Matt, and welcome to the second installment of our Advent reflection series, God with Us, where we're looking at the Incarnation of Christ as written by Saint Athanasius. We're doing this as a way to prepare ourselves to celebrate the great feast of the Incarnation of Christ, the Nativity, His birth into the world at Christmas. And we're using St. Athanasius as our guide. Last week in our first installment, we gave a little introduction about who St. Athanasius was and why it was that he wrote about the Incarnation when he did. So just kind of gave a little thumbnail sketch of history there to give us a context. And starting with this video, we're going to be looking at the text itself. It's divided into 8 chapters, and so there'll be 8 of these videos every Tuesday and Thursday leading up to Christmas Eve. And the chapters are not very long. They're a few pages each. The whole book is less than 100 pages. So I encourage you to read it. It's not necessary that you read this yourself in order to get something out of our discussion, but I encourage you to. It's available for free online in English translation, and I'll put some links in the description of the video to where you can find it online. So let's just get into the text here. St. Athanasius begins right off the bat by explaining to us very briefly the significance of the Incarnation and why it is that he's writing about it. And he leads off by recognizing the fact that many people object to the Incarnation, this idea that God entered into creation and became one of us, that God put on flesh. And the reason why he says many people object to that is it seems ungodly. It seems beneath God's dignity to do something like that. The thought that the Almighty God, the perfect God, the transcendent God, the maker of the whole universe, who himself is outside of the universe, would leave behind eternity and enter into time, enter into creation, and become one of his own creatures is ungodly. It's a non-divine act. It suggests that God would put limits on himself, that he would be willing to make himself small, to make himself vulnerable. And people just don't understand that. They object to that. And yet it's that very act of God that reveals to us something surprising about God. It reveals to us his humility, and it reveals to us his love. And this is all the more reason to believe in the Incarnation. What St. Athanasius says, I'll read it in his own words. He says, "Thus by what seems his utter poverty and weakness on the cross, he overturns the pomp and parade of idols, and quietly and hiddenly wins over the mockers and unbelievers to recognize him as God." The idea that God not only would be born as one of us, that he would become man, but that he would suffer and die on the cross is just too much. It's unbelievable. That's why St. Paul says that the cross is, a scandal for the Jews and a stumbling block for the Gentiles, because what God would do this? Our God, the Christian God, the God who is love. Because St. Athanasius also identifies the reason for the Incarnation, and that reason is none other than the salvation of man. And the reason why God would want to redeem mankind is because he loves us. It's because he loves us. There's no other reason for it. And so what St. Athanasius sets out to do in this first chapter of the Incarnation, after this brief little intro, is to demonstrate that the same God who renews creation from the cross in the salvation of man, the same God that renews creation by saving us, he's the very one who made creation to begin with. And so he takes us back to Genesis. He takes us back to the beginning, and he talks about the creation of the world. And just like he identifies objections for the Incarnation, he also identifies first some objections people have to the idea that God created the world. And he talks about, Gnostics, and he talks about Platonists, and he talks about different, other groups, other religious groups, other philosophies that would argue something other than the Christian idea of creation. And the one that struck me the most as I was reading this was he mentioned the Epicureans, because the Epicureans are materialists. And their view of creation, I think, is still around today. And that's what you'll encounter among a lot of materialistic atheists. And that is that there's no reason for us to believe that an intelligent mind had anything to do with the creation of the universe, that the material universe is kind of self-creating, I guess, self-generating. It's just always here, and there's no evidence that there's a rational mind behind it. And St. Athanasius deals with that very quickly, and he does so by pointing out the distinctions between things in the universe. That he says, if there were no rational mind organizing, giving order to the universe, you'd expect it to be kind of all uniform, all the same, this just homogeneous goo, I guess. Or you could expect chaos, and randomness. But he says that's not what you see. When you look at the world around you, you see distinctions. You see different types of things, and they all coexist, and they work together. There's an order to creation that shows us that there is a rational mind behind it that gives it purpose. Now, he doesn't use this example, but it came to my mind the image of a jigsaw puzzle, how it all fits together. If you came across a box that just had a random pieces of cut out cardboard, in it, and you fiddled around with a little bit and you figured out that, hey, these pieces all fit together. And when they all come together, it forms a picture. You'd know, oh, hey, this is something that someone made. Someone made this to be a puzzle, and it makes sense. It all fits together. You wouldn't conclude, oh, this is just a random box of just different size and shape pieces of cardboard. No, you'd understand that there's a purpose behind it because of the way that all these distinct pieces fit together to form a cohesive whole. And you can make the same argument about the universe. So St. Athanasius deals with some of these objections to the fact that God created the universe. And then he talks about how among all of God's creatures in the universe, man is special because man is the creature that God chose to make in his image, to impart his very image upon us. And the only reason that God would do that is because he wanted man to be able to share in his divine life, the life of blessedness, the life of the saints. But that life is contingent upon freedom. He makes an interesting comment that God knew that man's will could go either way. We could either choose to share in this divine life or we could reject it. And so he made that share in the divine life contingent upon one prohibition, which was not to eat of the fruit of the tree in the center of the garden, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And he doesn't spend a lot of time on this, but I think it's very interesting that he takes the time to remark that this share in the divine life is contingent upon our will, because we're made in the image of God, and God is the freest being, right? There's no limits on God. God is not restricted or bound by anything. God acts always from perfect freedom. And so if we are made in that image, that means that we also are made free. And you can make the same argument by saying that, God is love, as St. John says in 1 John. God is love. And if we're to share in that life of love, then we also have to be free because love requires freedom. Love is only love if it's freely bestowed. You can't coerce love. And so all of this implies that we must have free will. And so God puts one restriction upon our first parents in the paradise, which is not to eat of the tree in the center of the garden. Once we choose to do that, once we choose to disobey God, that's when death enters the world. Because you see, God is the source of our life. And once we turn from contemplation of God to contemplation of corruptible things, as St. Athanasius puts it, then we start to corrupt ourselves. Death enters into the human experience. Death enters into creation. And that creates a problem, but it also creates an opportunity, because that act of turning away from God and losing that life of God cries out to God for help. And that's what leads to the incarnation. See, St. Athanasius says, you may wonder, why am I writing about Genesis? Why am I writing about, the beginning of things? Why am I writing about creation and the fall of man? I'm supposed to be writing about the incarnation. It's the fall of man that led to the incarnation. And that's the whole point of it, right? Reading this, and as people are starting to kind of decorate their homes and get ready for Christmas and in the early part of December, it made me think about the great medieval tradition of putting on paradise plays as a preparation for the Christmas celebration. Just like around Easter, they would put on passion plays on Good Friday where they reenacted the Passion of Christ. Before Christmas, a lot of medieval towns and villages would put on paradise plays, and they would reenact the fall of Adam and Eve. And they would do this in churches and in town halls and even in people's individual homes. And so to do this, they would, of course, need to set up the area like the Garden of Eden, like paradise. And what's in the garden? Trees. So they would bring in trees or a tree from outside. And of course, this is paradise, so all the trees are alive and green. And well, what kind of trees are still alive and green in the middle of December in most parts of Europe? Evergreen trees, pine trees, fir trees. So they would bring in these trees, these evergreen trees. And then what is hanging on the tree in the center of the garden in paradise? It's fruit. You have to have the fruit for Adam and Eve to pick. Now, there's a long tradition in medieval art of showing the fruit, the forbidden fruit, as an apple. You may wonder why it's an apple, because it never says apple in Genesis. And it's a play on words. It's kind of an artistic pun, because the Latin word for apple is the same as the Latin word for evil, mal. And so they would, it was a visual pun. And so they'd hang apples on these paradise trees, as they were called. So you have these nice shiny red apples, or some other fruit, hanging on these, nice evergreen trees, these pine trees. And these paradise trees from the paradise plays are what became our Christmas tree. We still have that custom today of bringing an evergreen tree into our home and hanging these colorful ornaments on it. And so I mention that because it might be nice for you to reflect on that as you're decorating your homes for Christmas and you're setting up your Christmas tree, that's what that tree is meant to call to mind, is the fall of our first parents, our fall from grace, and how we lost that divine life of God that really isn't our inheritance, and how that transgression is what led to God sending his only Son, for God himself coming into the world as one of us, because God desires for us to share his life still. God made us to be incorrupt and full of life, his divine life. He gave us that gift. Our first parents lost it. And he gives us the opportunity to restore that gift, or to be restored to it by sending us his Son. So that's where we'll pick up in a couple of days on Thursday with chapter 2 of St. Athanasius' On the Incarnation. Until then, God bless.